Somewhere in central Italy, around 700 BCE, a civilization was building cities, smelting iron, engineering drainage systems, and producing gold jewelry of such technical precision that modern metallurgists spent decades trying to figure out how they did it. They ruled Rome. 3 of Rome's 7 kings were theirs. The toga the Roman senators wore came from them. The gladiatorial games, those came from them too, adapted from their own funerary rituals. The alphabet you are reading this in passed through their hands before it became Latin. For 7 centuries, they were the most sophisticated culture on the Italian peninsula. Then Rome absorbed them, and for the next 2,000 years, history recorded them as gone. That story held until September 24th, 2021, when a team at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History published a study in Science Advances that had sequenced ancient DNA from 82 individuals across 12 archaeological sites and nearly 2,000 years of Italian history. The origin question that had occupied scholars since the 5th century BCE was, at last, resolved. The answer was not what anyone expected. Actually, one person expected it, a Greek historian writing in the 1st century BCE who was roundly ignored for 2 millennia. We will get to him, who they were. The Etruscans occupied the region they called Etruria, modern Tuscany, northern Lazio, and parts of Umbria, and at their height between roughly 700 and 500 BCE, they controlled territory stretching from the Po Valley in the north down through Campania in the south. They were not an empire. They were a confederation of 12 city-states, each governed independently, linked by shared language, shared religion, and a shared set of trade relationships that made them extraordinarily wealthy. The wealth showed. Etruscan goldsmiths in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE developed a technique called granulation, fusing thousands of tiny gold spheres, some less than half a millimeter in diameter, onto the surface of jewelry without visible solder. The process required attaching the spheres using copper salt compounds and heat in a way that created a colloidal bond at the molecular level. It worked beautifully. It was also completely impossible for modern craftspeople to replicate until a goldsmith named H.A.P. Littledale figured it out in the 1930s, after extensive chemical analysis. The Etruscans were doing this casually in the 600s BCE. They gave Rome its first real urban infrastructure, the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer that drained the Roman Forum and allowed the city to exist as a city rather than a swamp, was an Etruscan engineering project, built under the Etruscan king Tarquinius Priscus, who took the Roman throne in 616 BCE. He was followed by Servius Tullius and then Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, expelled in 509 BCE in the revolution that established the Republic. Rome spent roughly a century under Etruscan kings, and then spent the next several centuries systematically erasing the acknowledgement. I find myself thinking about this dynamic a great deal. A civilization does the foundational work, the engineering, the alphabet, the religious calendar, the military organization, and the successor culture absorbs it, rebrands it, and files the serial numbers off. It is, to put it generously, a recurring pattern in history, the language that fits nowhere. The problem that made the Etruscans genuinely strange, not just historically obscure, but intellectually baffling, was their language. Etruscan is a language isolate. It is not Indo-European. It is not Semitic. It does not belong to any known language family that dominated the ancient Mediterranean world. It belongs to a microfamily called Tyrcenian, which comprises exactly 3 members: Etruscan itself, Rhaetian, spoken in the Alpine region, and Lemnian, spoken on the Greek island of Lemnos in the northern Aegean. In 1885, a stone stele was unearthed on Lemnos, bearing an inscription in a language that was structurally and lexically close to Etruscan. The word helok in Lemnian matched helu in Etruscan, meaning constructed. Grammatically, the 2 languages shared features, agglutinative morphology, left to right, subject, object, verb ordering, that appear nowhere else in the ancient Mediterranean record. A language spoken in the interior of central Italy had a close relative on a small island near the Turkish coast. This was, as ancient mysteries go, a significant one. The debate about what it meant had been running since at least the 5th century BCE. Herodotus, writing around 450 BCE, stated with complete confidence that the Etruscans had sailed from Lydia, western Anatolia, modern Turkey, during a catastrophic famine led by a prince named Tyrrhenus. This was the Eastern migration theory, and for most of recorded history, it was the default position. Strange language, strange customs, probably came from the East. The dissenting voice was Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in the 1st century BCE. He examined the Lydian language, compared it with Etruscan, found no meaningful resemblance, and concluded that the Etruscans were indigenous, that they had always been in Italy, that there was no migration, and that Herodotus had simply been wrong. Nobody listened to him for approximately 2,100 years, which tells you something useful about the persistence of origin myths once they are written down by someone sufficiently famous. The science gets complicated first. The early genetic studies conducted in the 2000s and 2010s did not resolve the argument. They deepened it. A 2004 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics extracted mitochondrial DNA from 80 Etruscans and found that their genetic relationships were closer to Eastern Mediterranean populations than to modern Italians, a finding that seemed to support Herodotus. A 2007 study by Alberto Piazza at the University of Turin examined Y chromosome data from the village of Murlo in Tuscany, a town so isolated it had preserved an unusually ancient genetic signature, and found a specific genetic variant shared almost exclusively with populations from Turkey. That same year, a separate study of mitochondrial DNA from modern Tuscans found roughly 5% of their mitochondrial haplotypes were shared only with Near Eastern populations, again interpreted as a trace of ancient Eastern migration. Then, a 2006 Stanford study used statistical modeling to conclude that ancient Etruscans were almost certainly not the primary ancestors of modern Tuscans, effectively arguing that whatever the Etruscans were, they did not leave a detectable genetic legacy in the people living there today. So by 2010, the scientific picture looked like this. The Etruscans probably came from the east, probably left no living descendants, and the village of Murlo was genetically Turkish for reasons nobody could explain. The situation was not exactly clarified. The problem was not the researchers. The problem was the technology. All of those studies relied on mitochondrial DNA, which is maternally inherited and covers only a fraction of the genome, or on Y chromosome data, which covers only the paternal line, or on modern populations used as proxies for ancient ones. None of them could sequence full ancient genomes at sufficient depth to resolve population structure. That capability arrived in the mid-2010s, and by 2021, a team had collected enough material to use it properly, what 82 skeletons actually showed. The 2021 study, officially titled The Origin and Legacy of the Etruscans Through a 2,000-Year Archaeogenomic Time Transect, led by researchers from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, the University of Tübingen, and the University of Florence, was the first to sequence whole genomes from ancient Italian individuals at the scale needed to actually answer the question. 82 individuals, 12 sites, a time window from 800 BCE to 1000 CE. The first finding, there was no detectable signal of a recent population movement from Anatolia into Etruria. None. The Etruscan genetic cluster was internally homogeneous and showed continuity with the existing Italian Bronze Age population. The sporadic presence of individuals from the Eastern Mediterranean, who clearly existed, traded, and occasionally settled, left no lasting demographic mark. Herodotus was wrong. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, the man nobody listened to, was right. The second finding was the one that stopped me when I first worked through the paper's supplementary data. The Etruscans carried large proportions of steppe-related ancestry, the genetic signature associated with the Bronze Age migrations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe that reshaped European population structure roughly 4,500 years ago. This is the same ancestry wave associated with the spread of Indo-European languages across Europe. The Etruscans had the genes, they did not have the language. Their language remained non-Indo-European, which means whoever brought that steppe ancestry into Italy arrived and, rather than replacing the existing linguistic community, was absorbed into it. This is a documented case of genetic population arrival without language replacement, and it is rarer than it sounds. The third finding was the one that reframes the entire story of Rome. The Etruscan genetic profile was not merely similar to that of the contemporary Latin population in Rome and Latium. It was near identical. two civilizations that ancient historians described as distinct, foreign to each other, and frequently in military conflict were, at a genomic level, essentially the same population. They never left. The study did not stop at the Etruscan period. It traced the genetic continuity and discontinuity across the Roman imperial era and into the early medieval period, running the timeline all the way to 1000 CE. Between roughly 100 BCE and 700 CE, the genetic composition of central and southern Italy changed substantially. This was not a mystery. The Roman Empire was one of the most powerful engines of human movement in the ancient world, drawing migrants, soldiers, administrators, enslaved people, and merchants from North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and the Balkans into the Italian peninsula. The imperial-era individuals in the study looked genetically different from the Republican-era individuals who preceded them, but after the imperial disruption settled, after the Western Empire collapsed and the demographic turbulence quieted, the genetic profile of people living in central Italy stabilized. The study found that the ancestry patterns visible in modern Tuscans and central southern Italians were substantially in place by around 1000 CE, meaning the gene pool had not shifted significantly in the last 1,000 years. The conclusion that follows from this is not subtle. The Etruscans were not